Actually, the topic, frequency response requirements for stereo loudspeakers, you would think that's a dead horse, you know, that should be a settled issue there, but let's just look at it, because stereo is fundamentally about hearing phantom sources, not real sources, but things that are happening between the loudspeakers, and your brain has to be engaged with that in order to hear it. And the brain is a wonderful thing that relies on various cues to put together an auditory scene that out of pieces that we are presenting from a left and a right loudspeaker. Okay. So next slide. So before I talk about stereo loudspeaker, let's say a few words about just a single loudspeaker in a room, a mono loudspeaker, and talk about a little bit about how we hear. Of course, simply here you have a loudspeaker and you have direct signals that reach both ears. There are reflections in the room, nothing that you wouldn't know already, but you might ask yourself, how do we actually hear what's happening? How do we hear this loudspeaker? And how do we tell direction? Okay, how do I know that he is clicking his camera over there right now? You know, how does the brain work the process there? Well, we get different signals at the two ears. That's very important. You know, that's what we're basing. And then we also use our body and our head, like to confirm that he is really there. I may turn this way, and there he is, right? So I get visual confirmation of what we're hearing. Now, in stereo, you don't have that visual confirmation. So there's a set of cues that is missing from our hearing that we normally use. But the other one is distance. How far away is he as he is clicking the camera? How do we get that information? Well, we use that, for that information, we use a lot of like reflections of this sound in the room that describe where he is. Tonality, well, that's something we hear it, but we also have a memory of what the sound of a clicking camera is, you know, for a shutter release is there. So we match that. If we listen to a loudspeaker, a fixed place loudspeaker, not he walking around, but if there's a loudspeaker there, we use another thing, and that is we move our head sideways there, we turn our head, and all these gives us cues at the ears, different signals at the ears that the brain uses to get the information about distance and information about the source. Now, if we are in a room that has a lot of reflections, this one is actually quite well damped. The place back there where we have the Orion, when you came in there and clapped your hand, it was just rattling around. We tried to tame it somewhat. But in a room that is highly reflective, where, say, my voice would bounce around, you would have a hard time understanding what I'm saying, because all these sounds superimpose at our eardrums there, and it gets more and more difficult for the brain to make sense out of this mix of air pressure variations. But we use a lot of memory. We recognize the gestalt of a human voice, the gestalt of instruments there. And so there's a lot of processing going on in the brain. And one of the things that is particularly unique to the brain that a microphone is not capable of simulating is that we have the ability to adjust our acoustic horizon. You know, just like visually, things are beyond the horizon, so you don't see them. Acoustically, we adjust our horizon to the things that are of interest, like you may come into a room and you hear a clock ticking. After a while, you won't even notice anymore that there's a ticking clock, because in your brain you have adjusted your horizon and say, well, that's not really of interest to me, this ticking clock, it's beyond the horizon, okay? And there are a lot of things like this, like I might have a conversation with my wife where there are all sorts of conversations going on, and my focus, my attention is right there, and therefore I blanket out all this noise that's going on simultaneously, right?
I'm glad he's doing that.
Yeah. I was always amazed how my son could study with music going on in this room there. And he said, oh no, it doesn't bother me at all, you know. And he was doing okay, so it must be all right. But we do this as just a survival mechanism in a way. All of this hearing is really based on survival. It's a mechanism that allows us to sort out from all these many signals that we hear, the ones that are of importance, that need attention. Next slide. So I said listening to a single loudspeaker. Well, there is really no such thing as a single loudspeaker in a room. I talked about the reflections. You can also say each of these reflections could be modeled by an image, namely another loudspeaker. So here I have actually built myself a little room corner out of mirrors. And I placed a little wooden loudspeaker there, a dipole, so it radiates front and back. And in red is the rear radiation, in black, that's what comes out the front. And you can see there are images everywhere. These are the side wall reflections. This is the floor reflection. This is a reflection from the wall behind the speaker. This is another reflection from the wall on the side of the speaker. Here's another floor reflection coming from the side wall. You know, it bounces. The way it constitutes, it goes from the speaker to the floor, and then here, and then comes back to the listener. So it's very complicated. This is just the corner, because there's, of course, also the ceiling above, and there's another wall back here, and another wall over on this side. And in each of these walls, you have images of that loudspeaker. And depending how reflective the room is, all those signals are coming back to you, and you hear them in addition to the direct signal from the loudspeaker. And the brain has this task to sort out what is a real signal, what are reflections, and in particular, if there's any new signal in there, what is it? Is it another loudspeaker? Is it an animal that might come and get me, or what is it, right? So we constantly have a picture in our mind of the room we are in, the space we are in, that allows us to maneuver acoustically speaking or hearing-wise speaking in this environment. For instance, I'm really convinced that when you enter this room, you immediately, pre-consciously, sort of scanned the room in terms of sound acoustically, based on the noises that were in here. There were people speaking, there was noise made, so you got right away an idea of what the acoustics of this space are, okay? So that when new sounds arise, you can sort of sort them in and are not surprised by that. Next one. So now let's ask, so what should be the frequency response for this mono loudspeaker in a room? What would make sense? And I would say on axis, it should be flat. And that's if we use it, look at the loudspeaker just as a reproducer. If I had recorded something with a single microphone at some distance, different location, and I play it back, I don't want to change the spectrum change as I play it back. So certainly the direct sound that I hear from the loudspeaker should be just a duplicate of the sound that the microphone picked up, right? But furthermore, the sound coming from the speaker, the direct sound, should not really change as I walk around in the room. As I walk over here or there, it should, in all directions, basically radiate the same sound. So this is to say that the source here should be omnidirectional, okay? As a matter of fact, the omnidirectional I would describe as the mother of all loudspeakers. Everything basically goes back to that. And when you look in acoustics, how people measure, for instance, the acoustics of a room, they use like a shot, with a pistol type shot, to get an impulse, because the sound from a small opening there spreads out uniformly in all directions, so you get reflections from every part of the room. In concert halls, when people analyze the sound of a concert hall, they use actually a large balloon. The balloon gets popped because that makes a very large pop here. As the pressure change and that illuminates the room and hopefully enough signal to capture the reflections in the signature of the concert hall. You know, as the sound comes from various directions to wherever the measurement point was in the room. Okay. So the source, in order to be omnidirectional, the source has to be acoustically small. And by that I mean it has to be small compared to the wavelengths that it radiates. If any part of that source is in the order of half a wavelength or so, you begin to get directivity. So it's very important, small source. Ideally it's a point source, but a point at 10 kilohertz, yes, it has to be a small point. At 100 hertz, where you have a wavelength of 3 meters or so, it doesn't have to be that small, right? But if you go up to 10 kilohertz, it has to be maybe in this order here or less than that. Okay. And now the room of course is involved because any sound that radiates in different directions from the speaker gets reflected. And the signature of this room, the reflections, the reverberation of this sound that rattles around should not change the spectrum, ideally, okay? So the room should be not too dead, not too live. It shouldn't be an anechoic chamber. Typically, we wouldn't feel comfortable in an anechoic chamber. If you ever have been in one, it's a very, very eerie feeling. Because it's so totally unnatural, we don't experience anything like this, where there's absolutely no sound and no reflection. You know, you make some noise, but nothing comes back, right? So you're in open space. But by the same token, a room that is very highly reverberant, like a reverberation chamber, which are also built for technical and measurement purposes, it's a very uncomfortable room because you can't understand a word in it. You know, everything just rattles around in it. And so somewhere in between those two extremes is where we like to live and hear and experience sound. And the concert hall is a good example of such a room that's in between those extremes. It's a large room, and it has a lot of reflection and reverberation, and it's a real art to design a room that there's just the right amount of reverb and still enough direct sound compared to the reverberant sound to have a very pleasing experience. It's a very subjective thing, right? And people still try to understand how to build exactly how to build it so it has good acoustics. And the way it's done is typically that there are certain halls that are known for good acoustics. And I heard one acoustician talk about this, and there are halls that are recommended, and usually the reason is that these are halls that have a large number of seats that have good acoustics, you know, so to speak, good acoustics there. Because practically every concert hall has some good seats, but you want one that has a large number of good seats, not just a good seat for the people who paid the money for building the concert hall. And then they measure and try to characterize the room from those locations in order to understand what is it exactly that is pleasing in our hearing as we experience music, say, in this concert hall, this space. Next. So now let's talk about stereo, which is really what this subject is about there. And again, from the hearing aspect, and again, let's say we use the same mono signal that I played to the signal loudspeaker, apply it to these left and right loudspeakers, and now we have a totally unnatural situation. It's a phenomenon that we have, if I speak in sort of evolutionary terms, we have never experienced, you know. There were never two tigers there at some angles from us that growled in exactly the same way, okay? But I had to figure out, is one there or is one there? And if I'm sort of right in the center, the brain has to say, I give up, it must be in between here, right? But then what we tend to do is we move a little bit over here and we say, it's over there, okay? But then you move this way a little bit, no, it's over there, right? And you turn your head, and when you're in the center and you turn your head, it's still right in front of you there. So there are a lot of confusing cues that we are getting in stereo. And stereo is fundamentally, it's a magician's trick. It's something we are trying to generate an illusion in our brain, something that is not happening. Like in this dual mono signal, there is no sound coming from here. There are no acoustic air vibrations coming from here. It's all coming from left and right loudspeakers, right? And out of those two signals coming at angles from us, we reconstitute in our brain something that is familiar usually. Usually we have memory of certain musical scenes or instruments. Hearing is a lot of learning, a lot of experience that is stored away in pattern matching and recognizing. And I think when audiophiles listen to music, they heavily rely on this memory of something they have heard here, or they have heard on this speaker and they don't hear on that speaker. But in my opinion, much of this is really an aberration and becomes sort of a listening for artifacts, because there is, of course, a lot of artifacts easily introduced into stereo in the whole signal chain. So based on these signals, these two signals, we are trying to, again, find directions, distance, and size. And now this is an interesting question. How far away is this phantom source? How do we determine that? Well, it's a phantom, so we don't know where. If for instance, you listen to headphones, put headphones on your head, put dual mono signals in left and right headphones, the phantom is right in your head. The image is smack in your head. It's not out there, it's in your head. In this case, with loudspeakers, it's not in your head, but it's in front of you. And how far away is it? Well, we get cues. We know there is a loudspeaker here and a loudspeaker there. So this and we know how far those are away, because those are real physical sources from which sound waves come. And like I said before, with head movements, body movements, and all sorts of reflections, cues, we know how far away these speakers are. And so the phantom source has to have at least that distance as the speakers, from where I'm listening. So that's where we place it. It's out there. It's not in our head. Now, if you did this setup in an anechoic chamber, and you put a person there, blindfolded, and you clamped his head, so he cannot clamp his head, and you play this dual mono to him, that person would experience the thing in his head, just like as if you had put headphones on it. And it's interesting, I've observed with some loudspeakers that are highly directional, so that there is, particularly at high frequencies, all the energy coming from here and there to it. It can actually happen that the solo, particularly solo voice, female voice or so, is not at this distance, but actually somewhere in front of the loudspeakers. Okay, that's sometimes people think that's a very good a mark of excellence or something, but it's really just the way our brain tries to deal with that situation. It doesn't have enough reflections or other inputs to localize that source. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Okay, so one of the problems with stereo is that we have the signals from left and right, and we're trying to imagine a source that's in between them. And as I'm sure you're aware of, there are things like crosstalk cancellation, which basically make sure that this signal from this loudspeaker that comes to this ear, but also to that ear, that this signal here is first of all canceled by an opposing signal from this loudspeaker, and correspondingly the signal that goes from this loudspeaker to that ear also is canceled by corresponding signal. So there would be electronic circuitry in front of the loudspeakers there that does that. And furthermore, the cancellation and the frequency response shaping at these ears has to be such that it is the same as the frequency response would be from this phantom source to the ears, okay? And that brings me to what's called the head-related transfer function, which is, I'm sure you have heard about. It basically describes how the sound pressure at my eardrums is a function of the angle of incidence, right? If the sound comes from the front, both eardrums get the same signal. If the sound comes from over there, this eardrum gets higher signal level, higher pressure, particularly at high frequencies. It also takes longer for the sound to come over to this ear, so there is a delay or phase shift. Furthermore, at high frequencies, if it's way over there, the source, my head blocks some of the sound, so the level is less at the sound. So it's a complicated relationship that changes with every angle, not only in this plane, but also in the up and down plane, so or from behind, or, you know, very complicated thing. And so this cancellation is at best an approximation. Okay, it's very difficult to do it precisely. But next picture, this approximation can be done better if you don't have the speakers that far apart. Actually bring them quite close together. And that arrangement is called a stereo dipole. Okay, it really only works with crosstalk cancellation. Otherwise, you say, well, you have no more spread for the phantom image, right? The speakers are too close together. But if you do the crosstalk cancellation, which becomes easier because the angle of incidence is not 30 degrees, it's more closer to 0 degree, same like for the phantom source here, then you can actually create a phantom source here, or the whole sound stage, that isn't just in the small space between the speakers, but really quite extends very wide, you know. It's a stereo. And next picture, that whole thing can also be done mechanically. Dan Kier and another author wrote about this in the 1980s, where they basically take the two speakers and put a big wall between them. Here, this is Dan sitting there. This is from behind. So you see here this piece of plywood, and here the two speakers. The tweeters actually right smack against the wall, you know, right close together. So you look at this thing, have the two speakers there, and yet the sound stage is not there. It's broad. It's very broad, wide sound stage in front of you, and that is because, well, as you saw in the previous picture, the signals from this loudspeaker only get to the left ear. From this speaker only to the right here. You know, this wall blocks this crosstalk, you know, that would come otherwise there. And furthermore, the brain has still cues that the source is out there, not like headphones between my ears, right? This is like headphone listening with a headphone sort of at a distance from you, right? But it's the same effect as if you had headphones on you, but they're not on your head, where everything then happens inside between the ears, but it's now outside in front of you. You know, it's again just an example of the processing that this processor does between the ear. Just amazing feat. Okay, let's look at the next picture here. So just to do this is. Just to look at the head-related transfer function, and I'm showing here just the transfer function for 30-degree angle. And scale here, this is 0 and 2.5 dB, so there are fluctuations there, and it's sort of erratic, particularly this is 30 degree, 60 degree, 90 degrees. Complicated function, very complicated looking, and so it's certainly not easily equalized, not even with a DSP engine is it that easily corrected for, equalized for. And there is also, of course, a phase shift associated with this. It's not necessarily a minimum phase function there because you have delays between the ears. And so what people do is see, can we approximate these curves, okay? Well, how would you approximate these curves? Well, you would look at some fundamental things that contributes to the shape of these curves. The most basic thing is that the head is sort of a physical object, which is not quite a sphere, more a spheroid type thing, but sphere is maybe a pretty good explanation. And then we have these appendages here, out here, right? These ear, the pinnae here, hanging out here, which are very important for directional hearing, because there's all kinds of little details here on our pinnae, which changes the frequency response depending from where the sound comes, whether from above or from an angle or from the front or so. It changes the frequency response. And yet, with all these changes in the head-related transfer function, the thing that I find most astounding is that if my wife sits here and talks to me, and I turn my head and look this way, and so the signals at my ears have totally changed, right? They were the same first. Now I hear it mostly on this ear, not so much on this ear. But she sounds absolutely the same, you know? The brain knows that I turn and puts an inverse filter in there that basically corrects for this change in signals at the eardrums. And the fine detail of those changes has a lot to do with the shape of the pinnae, and it's very individual, and the ear canal. And so it's when these head-related transfer functions are measured on real people, there's a lot of variation between individuals there. So best this year is sort of an average out of I don't know how many test persons that were used. This is from Blauert in 1996, but this kind of measurement has been repeated many, many times there. The head, but if you just look at the head and say, well, let's just see what happens if we model the head as a sphere. And so how big should the head be? Well, that's another question. So we again take an average of what the population's heads are. But then you get in a sphere. Now for a sphere you can calculate very precisely what the sound pressure is, say at one point on the sphere as sound comes from different angles to that point, right? It's not a simple calculation, but it can be done, particularly with computing power these days can be done. And so you get a set of curves here where this is the frequency axis, and it's normalized relative to the size of the sphere. So this graph applies for any size sphere. And you see here how the sound pressure changes with respect to different angle of incidence. And here it's 0, 90, 100. It's in 10-degree increments. And you can see this whole family of curves there. This is 180 degrees. This is from behind, which is a very unique point there on the sphere. But again, it's still, there are a lot of wiggles in there in these curves, but there are general trends in these curves that you can see, okay? And those trends in those curves are used in practice actually to simplify this issue here in many applications, particularly like in virtual reality game things there where maybe you're playing a video game with a 3D scene in front of you because you have glasses on you and you have a head tracker on your head, and as you move your head, you're actually looking around in this three-dimensional scene. You can look up and down, while at all this time the signals in your ears are constantly changing. And if that is done with a very fast computer, you will not notice. I've experienced that years ago on something, a video game, of course, one of these military things where you had airplanes flying and helicopters, and you had to shoot, they had to detect them and shoot them down and so. But it was absolutely fascinating, like the scene in front of me in these goggles, three-dimensional scene, was sort of a cartoonish-like scene. Wasn't really photographic in its accuracy, but it was totally three-dimensional. You know, it was 3D, and you had really a sense that I was sort of on a hill, and could look up and down in the valley, and so, you know, good viewing spot I had. And as I turned around, I could see how the landscape changed, and so on. Then all of a sudden you hear a sound coming from somewhere in the distance, a helicopter, a chopper, you know. And you go, and then it comes closer, and if you don't do anything, it comes flying, and then flies over my head, and then here I see it, there it is, and then it sort of disappears over on the horizon, right? But you can also, as I hear this thing coming there, I could say, oh, it's coming from back there, because your brain has enough cues to get that thing. So you turn around and say, there, I'm looking right at it as it coming towards me, right? And then, of course, all of a sudden somebody else comes from that other angle, so it's meant to be confusing pretty quickly, so that you don't have such an easy time to find the target, right, and shoot it down. But it's all based on changing your eardrum signals according to where you look, and yeah, it's basically, and also having the visual cues there, right? This all works together and helps.
Did this game change the sound for the 3D placement of the sound?
Yes, yes, absolutely. You had, for instance, also this helicopter flying over in speed. You have the Doppler effect, right? So
I'm saying, if it's behind you, does it sound one way? If you turn towards it, does it sound a different way now that you're facing it?
No. No, it sounds normal. It sounds just like normally it would sound to you. But the signals at the eardrums were very different when I was looking this way versus when I turned toward it.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, but it sounded just like you naturally experienced. That's how we can fool ourselves into thinking this is a real, you know. They call it artificial reality. Okay, so this idea of using some of these curves, I found was necessary to also use in the stereo loudspeakers that I'm developing or building, like the Orion that we are playing here in one of the rooms. And I had gone back to that speaker because it had been 2002 when I had first developed it and measured it and spent all the time on it. But since that time, not really changed much in terms of frequency response. I added a rear tweeter for other reasons. And so I thought it was time to take another look at the thing, because I also had ideas in my mind, in my head, of building something new. But then as I got into that, I thought, well, maybe I should check whether I did everything all right in the first place on the Orion there. So I ended up remeasuring it, finding, yes, there was an area, and fortunately it was in an area that I also thought I had heard there was something not quite right. So I corrected that, and in the process tried to get a frequency response as flat as possible on axis, okay? And I do this outdoor measurements. And then I took, and the Orion, by the way, is a loudspeaker that radiates in all directions, not with the same strength, but with the same signature, with the same spectrum, okay? It's a dipole. in that sense. And when I put it back in the room to listen to it, after I did the modification, it was too bright. It sounded too bright. Not a big deal, because I knew that from experience, that if you take a loudspeaker and you equalize it for flat under free field conditions, and you listen to it in a room, it's usually is too bright, particularly when it has very wide dispersion. On a narrow dispersion, no, they're different effects, but on a wide dispersion speaker, that's the case. And so, not a big surprise, so I said that the normal practice is we adjust the tweeter level, and since everything is, in my case, active circuitry, it's just changing the tweeter gain. So change it a little bit, and everything should come out right. But it didn't. And that was, and I didn't just work on it myself. I have a good friend, Don Berenger. He lives in Arlington, Virginia, across the country. And we compare notes. He duplicates everything that I built over there, and he listens, and I call him my other pair of ears, sort of to either confirm or keep me on track or so. And Don has a big benefit that he is a trained musician, professional musician, but who later couldn't execute his profession due to a motorcycle accident there, and he became a recording engineer. But he has absolutely good ears and hearing. Not that he can put it in engineering terms, though, but we can communicate to each other, so we understand what he hears and he can understands what I hear. And we compared notes, and he also couldn't arrive at the right thing. And so let's look at the next picture here. Okay. So I then thought, well, maybe it has something to do that we really are trying to correct for the fact that sound arrives from plus minus 30 degrees in stereo, but the phantom source should be in front, and the frequency response coming from the sides is not the same as the phantom source would have. Okay? And this is going back again to the sphere model, and here again in a simplified form are the frequency responses from different angles. But the ones that I'm particularly interested in is how the response, and I could only get data for 22.5 and 45 degrees, in other words from 22.5 and 45 degrees, how that sound, the spectrum of that sound, was different from the sound that comes right from the front. And that's what you see in these two curves here, right? Still a wiggly curve. But it has something in it, and this is all based on the sphere, that at low frequencies, the thing is angle, pretty much angle independence, because the head is a small object, acoustically small. But at high frequencies, it has a lot of blockage. And so you have an upward shelf here of about 3.3. That's quite consistent. And our equalization, in the end, turned out to be the inverse of this curve, which isn't quite following these wiggles here, but again, what I think is significant, we ended up empirically, even before I did this analysis here, we ended up with 3.2 or 3.3 dB difference in high frequency output to low frequencies, meaning the inverse, meaning we had to drop the high frequencies down, okay? Now this dropping down, when you adjust just the tweeter level, the dropping down occurs right where the crossover frequency is, which was at 1.4 kilohertz. So you have coming from low frequencies, it's flat, and then at 1.4 kilohertz, we have a drop down, and then it's flat again, right? And it's a pretty narrow step there. And somehow this just did not, we couldn't get it to sound right. There was always something wrong spectrally, not the right balance there. So that's why we said, let's set the whole thing to flat, just flat response, and now take a simple shelving filter, to roll down the response gradually, okay, and find out where in frequency that should be. Should it be centered at 1.4 kilohertz? And if so, well, how wide should it be? You know, how long a transition? Where should it start and where should it end? And we experimented a lot with that. Next picture. And here you see some of the curves that we worked with. This was the very first curve, and you see it starts somewhere like 500 hertz, and then pretty much by 10 kilohertz we were done. And that wasn't quite the right thing. Then we went what looks pretty drastic. I said, well, let's just take a slope of 2 dB per decade. I had good experience in the past with just what's called a tilt control, where you take basically the whole spectrum, you put in a slope, say 1 dB per decade, 2 dB, 3 dB. Oftentimes 3 dB per decade seemed to work really well. And 3 dB per decade going from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, you know, just is rather than being flat, going at a slope, you know, at 3 dB per decade. So in 3 decades, you're 9 dB down, you know, from 20 kilohertz, you're 9 dB down. Goes like this. So we played around with this. This turned out to be version 2. And since all the stuff that I'm doing is DIY, so people are out there, and I say, okay, we came up with this equalization, and people build it, and so we were pretty excited. And then some people in here, and I think some are in the audience here, yes, there's someone like Eric out there said, geez, this is not right. He gave one of these. As a matter of fact, before we even published it on the web, I asked several people to say, try this out, see what you think, you know, and several reports came back positive. His didn't come back positive. But by that time, I think we had it already on the website. And so we said, well, we better do some more working on there. So we continued working, and then the next version was this one, this straight line. And I thought it worked pretty good, but Dan had problems here at the low end. You know, we couldn't quite settle where it should start at the low end here. And then, well, if you went too far down here, then by the time you're at the high end, you're off there. So that lasted only for a while, and by now everybody was getting really nervous out there and saying, well, I just found the capacitors to do these changes, and now you're changing it again there. So what can you do? It was something a manufacturer, if I was a manufacturer, I should never do, you know. It wasn't finished yet. So eventually we settled on this version here. But the thing that was to me the most astounding experience was that how critical this curve is. That we made changes in the order of 0.2 of a dB. Now, given over some range in frequency, but something I could not measure acoustically, electrically on the electrical network, I can of course easily model it and see it. But if you had told me 4 weeks before that, well, things like this matter, I would have said, well, okay, well, I don't know, you know. But this time, the most amazing thing was that I made those changes, heard something. Dan back east made those changes, heard the same thing, which is, you know, and he has a different room, he has a different set of the same speakers, right, and the same electronics, and all this is the same. But we heard minute, what I would consider minute changes that I wouldn't have believed were real, you know, that you could reproducible do this. And actually I put on the website then, you know, change it from this to that, and hear a difference there. At least we hear a difference there, and people do hear a difference, which is almost like when you work with a camera and you're focusing in it, when you're focus, say, on an object, on a face or so, like this. When you're away from it, well, you're away from having the right photo. But when you're getting close, there comes a point where it just snaps, sort of. It's there's just where it's just right. And this thing here had sort of the snapping type effect. You deviate a little bit from it this way, no. That way, no. But if you were just right on it, was right. So I still feel somewhat uneasy about the sensitivity, and it sort of makes me wonder how much chance anyone has to build a decent loudspeaker when you have this small variability, and furthermore, where you have to count on the manufacturer of the drive elements, which in our case is Sears, that the driver that I buy is the same that somebody else buys, in terms of performance, and they do a good job. I've seen their production data, production runs, the variability, but it's still, you're talking easily, they're plus minus half a dB or so in sensitivity and response type variations there, and we were playing around with much smaller numbers there. So I have adjustment pots on for the tweeter level, and so maybe you can find the right spots there, or maybe not. So that's where we are. So next picture. Oh, and the networks themselves here they're pretty simple. It's just an RC ladder. This was a more complicated one for the 2 dB per decade. All right. Next picture there. Where are we? Okay, so we talked about the on-axis response. Now, the off-axis response of a stereo speaker, I'm quite convinced from all my work, it has to be the same as the on-axis response. So if we put this flat with a downward shelf on-axis, it has to be the same off-axis. And that's, of course, the reason for it is that the signals coming back from the walls and from different directions should have the same spectral content as a direct signal. That just makes it a lot easier for the brain to do a number of tricks. And one of them is to hide the loudspeakers. So when you're playing sound, you're not aware of the loudspeakers. There's just a phantom image in front of you. And furthermore, and most importantly, the room itself is moved beyond the acoustic horizon. Now, that doesn't work in the room that we have here because it is just too reverberant, right? And too, in a way, too big. There's not, I would actually like to have reflections from close by. Reflections are a good thing. I would like to stress that. People always think they need to put absorbers there on sidewalls and stuff to get rid of the reflections. That is not the issue. Reflections, the brain needs those to localize, to know what's going on, and to be able to construct a believable phantom source there. So if you want a loudspeaker that radiates uniformly, it has to be either an omni, okay, and people have built omnis, nothing special there, or a dipole, or a cardioid. Those are the basic forms for building loudspeaker. There's a question?
Considering how large your baffle is in relation to the tweeter, how do you maintain clean spectral content knowing that? I mean, to me, just trying to visualize what perturbations may occur because of the large baffle.
Yes. Okay, let me see if this, I will answer your question, but let me just see if this here is, yeah, this is as good a place as any.
I mean, I'm familiar with your speaker, and it's magnificent.
Yeah, no.
Well, how come I'm not hearing little anomalies?
The dipole, and maybe that's, if you build an omni, let's start there. If you build an omni, your sources have to be acoustically small, otherwise it's not omnidirectional, right? When you build a dipole and you have a baffle there, the baffle certainly, well, if it's anything like this or so, that's not small at high frequencies, okay? It's no longer acoustically small. It's maybe small at low frequencies, even at mid frequencies up to true dipole behavior usually stops for a baffle of this size around 500 hertz or so, okay? And when I say true dipole behavior, I mean you have radiation that goes to the front and to the back from the cone there. And when I'm standing in front of the speaker there, the radiation that goes to the back, also some of it comes around the baffle, right? Comes to the front and interferes with the front sound. And the shorter the path length is for the signal from the back to come to the front, the stronger it will interfere and try to cancel the front sound. That's why you have this 60 dB per octave curve, right? At base frequencies, very little path length, so it's almost exactly out of phase and will cancel the front. Okay, and you have to equalize it for that. But as frequency goes up, the wavelengths get shorter, so there's more phase shift coming around. But there's also another thing happening, that the driver, say if you have an 8-inch driver, the driver by itself begins to get more directional, okay? So it will send, the one from the rear will send less sound around to the front, okay? So sort of the true dipole behavior stops. It is still dipolar. In other words, they're still radiating to the rear and to the front, but the two sources don't interfere with each other.
If you took your tweeter and measured it at 90 degrees from the side, would you measure any anomalies?
You mean, well, right now in the Orion I have two tweeters. Right. They are on a baffle that's basically this wide, so certainly not acoustically small, right? But the tweeter itself, it's crossover at 1.4 kilohertz. And at 1.4 kilohertz, it's still fairly omnidirectional, so there is from the rear tweeter a little bit coming around from the back. Not much, really not much. So if you go on axis, not that much makes it to do it. But if I'm off axis, say at 60 degree off axis, so I see the front tweeter at 60 and the rear tweeter at 60, there, yes, the rear contributes. Now if you go all the way to 90 degrees, then front and rear tweeter have the same path length, same problem, and they truly interfere. So in this plane, I still have the cancellation of the dipole, okay? And as I get further to the front or to the rear, you less and less of this interference, and you again form this characteristic figure of 8 radiation pattern. Now, I know some people on the web try to build a dipole that goes all the way up to 10, 20 kilohertz. Well, if you want to keep the path length small, of course, you have to be, in the order of this here. Well, but then you have the tweeter output from the rear now interferes with the front, so it cancels part of the front output. So you need to put out more signal. So there is something net remaining because you want to hear the tweeter, right? You don't want the rear to cancel the front tweeter. So whatever diaphragm or ribbon or whatever you have has to move more heavily because you're using part of it to cancel the front, just to get true dipole behavior. But you have to be very careful if you drive it too fast. To high in frequency, a dipole is 60 dB per octave at low frequencies. And then it begins to actually, the rear radiation, when it's 180 degree phase shift, it adds. So you get 60 dB more output than if you had just the front. But then after that, then it all of a sudden drops down where it really cancels. and then comes up and cancels and comes up. This has a comb filter. You basically have a comb filter. And that's the reason you really don't want to work in. And fortunately, if you use the directivity of the driver itself, the tweeter driver or the mid-range driver, you can stay out of that comb filtering region, but still have a dipole behavior. It would better be called dipolar, like a dipole. It's not really a dipole, but dipolar in the sense it radiates to the front and to the rear. The two are out of phase, and off to the sides, they cancel. You get the nulls there. And with a tweeter, to build a true dipole now, I think is foolish in a way, because you can't move enough air to do it. And I'm a firm believer that you need the high frequency output from the tweeter in all directions, to get the right balance of the sound in the room, to get a flat power spectrum, basically, and to get enough output. Because again, in hearing, to give some realism to this phantom source, you also have to play at near realistic level. Probably you cannot do it really at full realistic sound levels, particularly not in a small living room. The phantom source just doesn't fit. It doesn't. It's always going to be a sort of a scaled down version. If, say, you're trying to reproduce a symphony orchestra, if you're trying to reproduce a saxophone playing or piano playing, you may get pretty close to what the real thing was there. But other ones, there is just, the room cannot stand it, cannot tolerate it. Next picture, just a space bar. Okay. So then one last thing here. So if we have the right direct frequency response and the right reflected frequency response from the stereo loudspeaker, there's one more very important thing that has to be done. These loudspeakers have to be away from the walls, at least 1 meter, 3 feet. And the reason for that is so that the reflected signal has to travel a longer path. You can see the reflection would have to go here and there first. And when you look at it more closely, that's as if you had a speaker down here. And you will find that its path length is such that the signal from the reflection is in the order of 6 milliseconds or more delayed. And that is enough of a time gap compared to the direct sound for the brain to differentiate it or to not associate it with the direct sound. If the speakers are too close against the wall, it gets too difficult for the brain to know, do I hear direct sound plus reflection sort of merging as one source, or are there really multiple sources? Like I first showed in the picture with the mirrors, there's one speaker and then many other speakers. But the brain can say, oh yeah, these other speakers are there because of the room. And the room is not of interest to me, okay? So I can sort of blank out the room. I can take the room out of the equation and just focus on the phantom source.
10 milliseconds?
6. 6. Yeah, 10 is fine, but at least 6. And we can talk about precedence effect and Haas effect and all this kind. It's all in the same direction. It's basically our ability for survival reasons that the first arriving sound is the one that we want to focus attention to, right? Because that's the first message that we are getting, that there might be something of interest here. And so the setup is important. Now the reflected sound in this area of the room should not be absorbed, as you will find in recording studios or so often done, where they have sort of a live end, dead end set up, but their dead end is behind the speakers and the live end here is behind the listener. I'm just saying the opposite. Diffuse end. Do not dissipate the energy back here, but let it come back as reflected energy, but diffuse. And then on this end, you want to have the sound streaming and sort of disappearing, ideally. So a long room, or room with openings in the back, the rest of the house or whatever where the sound disappears, particularly at low frequencies, is, I think in my book, is an ideal situation. A small, all-enclosed room is sort of the worst case. Yeah, next. Okay, well, I talked about the phantom source in the center, and that phantom source, of course, in a recording studio, you can, by changing the level on left and right channels, you can move it anywhere between, or by changing the delay between channels. And so in recording techniques where they record often with many microphones, different instruments, they just placed these different instruments between the loudspeakers based on the amplitude or time difference that they give to the different signals there. And we don't need to spend time on that. Let's look at the next one. And what that causes when you synthesize a recording like this, multiple sources that are recorded and then pan-ported between the loudspeakers, usually lacks depth. Often when you listen to these recordings, sounds are stacked on top of each other. You know, here's the center soloist, and the string bass, by the way, is right in front or behind it, you don't know, because there's no depth really, they're sort of smack on top of each other. And then the other sources to the left, to the right. Very artificial because there's no real space surrounding the instruments. Now you capture, of course, a real space if you use recording, say, just with two microphones for left and right channels, and from an audience perspective here. But when you do it this way, you really need to have a hall that has good acoustics, because you also record the hall, which is what you want, but not every recording hall is really that great. So that typically, much more typically, particularly in orchestral recording, is you have the conductor here in the orchestra, you have a main pair of microphones, and then all kinds of spot microphones, these green dots,